Hello, I'm Marco Davis, President and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Welcome to CHCI's 2023 Capitol Hill Briefing Series. This series is the culmination of CHCI's premier 9-month postgraduate fellowship program, which offers exceptional Latinos from throughout the country unparalleled hands-on experience working in public policy here in Washington, D.C. This unique fellowship program seeks to enhance participants' leadership abilities, strengthen their professional skills, and increase the presence of Latinos in public policy areas, this year specifically in the areas of health, technology, housing, education, and the environment. CHCI is thrilled to offer our postgraduate fellows the opportunity to share their perspectives on policy issues they're passionate about, and convene leaders in this work for an informative conversation. We'd like to thank our postgraduate fellowship program sponsors, whose support for the program is invaluable. The sponsors include Meta, the PepsiCo Foundation, America's Health Insurance Plans, the Walton Family Foundation, Bristol Myers Squibb, Microsoft, DaVita, Wells Fargo, and CVS Health. During and after today's session, you can keep this important conversation going and broaden the number of people engaged by using the hashtag CHCIFellows on social media. We hope that you will. To learn more about our postgraduate fellowship program, as well as our other leadership programs and special events, please visit chci.org. And we encourage you to reach out to our fellows directly via LinkedIn to learn more about their policy topic, and also please help them connect with job opportunities for when their program concludes in May. Thanks so much for joining us. And now, enjoy the discussion.
Good afternoon. My name is Caroline Gonzalez-Scott, and I'm Vice President of Programs at CHCI. I'm excited to welcome you to the CHCI Policy Briefing session titled Permitting of Clean Energy Infrastructure, the Dual Challenges of Speed and Environmental Justice, organized and moderated by CHCI graduate fellow Amar Bhardwaj. As Amar will elaborate, tackling the climate crisis means building a lot of new clean energy infrastructure, and the long process for obtaining permits for these projects puts the energy transition in jeopardy. At the same time, energy projects have a long history of creating environmental injustices for Hispanic communities and other communities of color across the country. How we approach permitting will be critical for these communities and how they fare in the energy transition. With today's discussion, Amar will dig into why and how we must improve the permitting process to build clean projects faster while safeguarding environmental justice. Amar has been trending towards this conversation for some time now with his work on clean energy. At the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, he worked on the Commission's ongoing landmark rulemaking on power transmission line permitting and build-out. And at the International Energy Agency in Paris, he led the agency's hydrogen trade work in advising national governments on navigating the energy transition. Through his CHCI fellowship, Amar served first on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where he authored 2 bills on reducing emissions in heavy industry and worked on permitting legislation negotiations. Amar is now at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where he helps guide policy on the implementation of over $200 billion in new industrial decarbonization programs. Now, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Amar Bhardwaj to tell us more about clean energy permitting.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for the introduction and for the work you do in leading this amazing CHCI fellowship program. And as Caroline mentioned, the work that I've had the chance to do through the CHCI fellowship on the Energy and Commerce Committee and at the White House now has really given a front seat to both the mechanisms of permitting in the overall climate conversation, and has underscored for me the importance of having responsible permitting reform in a broader climate and environmental justice approach to the challenges we face today. So I want to open up today by doing a little bit of framing around this conversation we're going to have before I bring in the panelists that I'm really excited to have providing some expertise and further color to the topic. So tackling the climate crisis is in many ways a matter of building infrastructure. For meeting the nation's goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, we're going to need to quickly build a lot of power transmission lines to get renewable energy into cities and industrial facilities. We're going to need to build renewable electricity generation facilities themselves, clean energy manufacturing, transportation networks, and new industrial configurations. And right now, the US isn't on track to build this infrastructure fast enough to meet our climate targets. For example, there's a Princeton University study recently that found that the US has to more than double its pace of electricity transmission build out to keep climate goals within reach. And one reason behind the slow pace of infrastructure build out that we're seeing is the long lead times to obtain the federal, state, and local permits needed for a project to move forward. That permitting process can be one of the longest parts of developing an energy project and sometimes take over a decade to complete. And these projects have to get permits from a wide variety of jurisdictions that their project touches on, from agencies at the local, state, and federal levels, each with their own separate processes and requirements and timelines, which can add a lot of time to the development of a project. For example, the right-of-way permits from the Federal Bureau of Land Management, which is often one of several steps for a given project, takes an average of 4 years for transmission lines, 3.5 years for pipelines, and over 3 years for renewable projects. So given those long timelines, it's an imperative for U.S. climate progress that we speed up the clean energy permitting process. But at the same time, environmental advocates stress that any efforts that we take to reform the permitting process must not undermine a critical function of those regulations, which is to safeguard against injustices to communities and ecosystems that are affected by infrastructure projects. And the US has a long history of environmental injustices, even under the current regulatory framework we have for permitting that already takes a decent amount of time for existing projects. There's a large body of evidence that Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and other people of color across the United States are subject to air pollution, toxic waste, lead poisoning, water contamination, and climate change impacts at disproportionate rates. For example, there was a 2016 report that found people of color are twice as likely as white people to live within a mile of polluting industrial facilities. And a perfect example of this issue is Cancer Alley, a region of Louisiana that's concentrated with over 150 petrochemical facilities, whose air pollution has created a 53% higher risk of cancer for those non-white residents, predominantly in the region. And on top of this environmental pollution and environmental justice impact of infrastructure, some types of infrastructure, especially natural gas pipelines, give developers eminent domain when they get a federal permit. And that allows a developer to take private land, often without adequate compensation for the landowner, in order to build their project along the line or siting that was agreed upon. And so that eminent domain authority has led to environmental injustices as well by dispossessing residents of their land and locating projects in proximity to unwilling landowners. So the energy transition can either further entrench the injustices borne by communities of color, or it can secure the health and well-being of these communities while revitalizing economic opportunity and social mobility. And the permitting process is going to be a central piece of determining what path we end up taking as we address the climate crisis. And for those reasons, it's going to be critical that the permitting process and the efforts that we take to improve it allow for both the speed of clean energy build out so that we meet climate targets in time, but also maintaining strong safeguards for the affected communities of these pieces of infrastructure and ensuring stewardship for those communities and the environment as we build everything we need to address these challenges. So now we have a phenomenal panel of experts that I'm going to bring in to discuss this much further. Before I introduce them, I'll note the audience can submit questions in the chat as we go, and we'll have an audience Q&A towards the end and get some of your questions answered as well. So without further ado, let me bring in my panelists today. First off, we're going to have Raul Garcia, who is the Legislative Director for Healthy Communities at Earth Justice. In his work at Earth Justice, He ensures that communities are safeguarded from environmental pollution that I've mentioned, from pesticides and toxic chemicals and beyond. And he leads Earth Justice's team advocating and defending these environmental safeguards. He's a native of Mexico City who moved to Chicago at age 10 and sees environmental advocacy as an extension of his professional history protecting and advancing the interests of underrepresented communities. And he's an advocate for the Latino community as well. So thanks for being here, Raul.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And now I'm going to move to our next panelist, and we'll circle back to hear from each of them as we go. Michael Drummond, who's the Director for Permitting and Innovation at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He joined the Council on Environmental Quality after a little bit of a time outside of it earlier this year, but has spent nearly a decade at the White House Council on Environmental Quality working on federal permitting issues, as well as working on those very same issues at the Department of Transportation and at WSP USA. So Michael has really been doing federal permitting for as long as he's been doing anything, and is going to provide a lot of expertise here on the federal permitting process. He helped draft the first comprehensive update to CEQ's National Environmental Policy Act, implementing regulations in over 40 years in his last stint at CEQ, and also led the development of the first government-wide reports on environmental impact statement timelines and page counts. Thank you for being here, Michael.
Thank you, Amar. Good to be here.
All right, and last but not least, we're going to have Mary Jo Barak, who is a program and project supervisor for infrastructure permitting and the California Environmental Quality Act at the California Public Utilities Commission. Mary Jo has over 25 years of experience working on California policy issues and also background in local permitting issues. She was also elected to the Menlo Park City Council in 1998 and was the mayor of Menlo Park in 2000. And Mary is going to provide a really important state-level perspective on the permitting challenges we're facing, and so we can cover all levels of this very multidimensional issue. Great to have you here, Mary Jo.
Thanks, Amar. I look forward to our conversation.
Perfect. So let me go back to Raul, and I'm just going to have everyone give a couple minutes about their sort of background and the work they do now and how that intersects with the broad permitting question. So Raul, let's have you take it away.
Yeah, so I am as you mentioned, I'm the legislative director for healthy communities at Earth Justice, where particularly in my portfolio, we work a lot with frontline communities who experience the historic and current burden of failures in our pollution control system across the country. And so that ranges from the pollution that stems from energy production sector, transportation sector, agricultural sector, et cetera. And I have been covering permitting for almost a decade now. A lot of times when the federal government in particular, but also some state governments are making big decisions that are going to impact the lives of everyday people, particularly those communities that are most impacted by this pollution. The permitting process is actually the only tool that the communities on the ground have to raise their voice, either for or against the project. And so for us, it's a deeply personal process, and it's not just procedural in nature. It's about building buy-in from communities on the ground for good projects. It's about improving projects that need to be improved, and ultimately, it is about eliminating bad projects that are going to do more harm than good. I bring a lot of advocacy and my own personal experience working and living in the southwest side of Chicago along the Des Plaines River, which is a highly industrialized area, and just being privileged enough to be able to travel to a lot of the communities around the country that have to face the worst of the pollution control failures that we have in our current system.
Well, thank you, Raul. That's definitely going to be exciting to pull through those different experiences and work areas you focus on in this discussion. Let's go to Michael now. Have you say a few words.
Sure. Thanks, Amar. Good to be here today. Uh, so, as Raul was talking about, the community involvement in the process, the work that I've done here at CEQ is focused largely on the National Environmental Policy Act, which is one of our nation's foundational environmental laws, passed in or enacted in 1970. It is a law that requires, an environmental impact assessment process. So essentially, requires the federal agencies to look at the environmental impacts and alternatives to actions that are proposed before them. So this can range from, an agency that's going to fund a project. The Federal Highway Administration is going to provide funding for, a bridge, roadway, whatnot, or in instances where a private business or individual is seeking a permit from a federal agency, can also require a NEPA review. So that's one of the kind of cross-cutting environmental review laws that we have. Large infrastructure projects would also require, a variety of other laws to be complied with, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and so on. But here at the federal level and at CEQ in particular, our focus is largely on the environmental review process as it pertains to NEPA. But we also work with agencies across a variety of laws because they're all intersecting in some way. And for any particular project, usually NEPA is treated as kind of the umbrella, where the one lead agency is going to conduct this broad environmental impact assessment, look at resources from community impacts, socioeconomic impacts, wetlands, water, air, noise, and so on. And then an agency that has a specific jurisdiction, right? Species would be, say the Fish and Wildlife Service. They'll be involved in that review, but kind of in a narrower scope. So it is a pretty complex process, especially when you get to some of these large projects. And community involvement is a big part of the NEPA process. Most environmental documents will have to go out for review. Depends kind of on the level of impacts that you may have. Uh, but that engagement that Raul was talking about, I think, is at the heart of many of the approaches that are taken in the environmental review process. And when done well, communities are engaged with early in the process, so that the lead agency on the federal side can understand what are the most important issues facing that community when it comes to the existing impacts from past actions, but also if this particular project is going to add to some of that, how can the project proponent and the agency best adapt the project to avoid some of those, minimize other impacts, or where they can't do either of those things, to mitigate, so that they can, as best they can, offset some of that. So really think that early public engagement is kind of key, and something that, when done well, can really result in better projects, and actually speed up the process, because when you've taken that information into account at the outset, less likely to have opposition that builds and might result in a lawsuit or something further down the line. So looking forward to talking more about this. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, definitely a lot of themes to pull through there as well. And Mary Jo, let's kick it to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. In California, we have the California Environmental Quality Act, and it is very much akin to NEPA. It was signed into law in 1972 by Ronald Reagan when he was the governor of California. It's changed a lot since then. And what I do at the CPUC is we act as a lead agency for a lot of large energy projects. Most of them are linear in nature. They cross, many miles, different jurisdictions. Sometimes they're on federal lands. Sometimes we do both. We act as lead agency for both a CEQA and NEPA review. Sometimes we let the federal agency take on that role, and we act more as a responsible agency. It's a long process. It is designed to analyze impacts from projects, as well as figure out ways to eliminate impacts, avoid impacts, mitigate if necessary. It's very much a public outreach program, and it's a disclosure program, so the decision makers will know exactly what they were approving when they were approving it, and whether there are better ways to lessen the impacts of the project, or perhaps not even approve the project. Um, it is it's a challenge. In California, we have a whole variety of entities that do licensing and permitting of energy projects. We have the California Energy Commission. They license power plants that are over 50 thermal power plants that are over 50 megawatts. Most of our solar and wind projects are actually approved at the county level. We have the California Independent System Operators. They actually look at the grid and figure out what projects we need to connect renewable projects to the load centers. And they come up with a list of projects which later come to us for our review. So it's a long process. It is complicated. And I agree with Michael, when it's well done and there's a lot of community outreach and involvement, you can really end up, I think, with a better outcome for the projects.
That's great. Thank you, Mary Jo. So I imagine that a lot of the audience today aren't as much of experts in the permitting process as you all are, and maybe even don't have a primer on how the permitting process actually works. So let's just start there on an overview. Michael and Mary Jo, you both work directly on the permitting process within government. So I'll have you each lay out a bit how the permitting process actually works, what the different elements and jurisdictions look like. Michael focusing on the federal level, and Mary Jo on the state and local level. So let's start with you, Michael.
Great. Thanks, Amar. So kind of got into this a little bit in my opening, but you've got a series of different and at times intersecting environmental review laws and authorities that exist out there. NEPA being one of the big ones. So there, if we'll take an electric transmission line as an example. Say it's crossing through multiple different states. There's actually not a federal regulator of first resort. There's not as there is with natural gas pipelines. There is no federal law that says you go to a single agency and they will approve your entire alignment. So I'll let Mary Jo talk about kind of the state side of that in a minute. But you may have federal intersections with, say, federal lands that are being crossed. And there's also, when you do have these federal authorities, there is a process of the Department of Energy for coordinating the environmental review around electric transmission lines. So that is something, but they don't have to issue a permit per se, right? As you would in some other instances. But certainly, federal lands that are being crossed, you would have a right of way that you would need to receive the access to. And a federal agency would conduct an environmental review, most likely for something large like that, an environmental impact statement. So they begin with the scoping process, analyzing, what are likely to be the big issues that will result in this process in terms of impacts. Pairing that with community engagement, and also identifying all the other federal agencies that would need to assist with the environmental review. So you may have the Fish and Wildlife Service for endangered species, as well as some of their other authorities, Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And then the Army Corps of Engineers may likely be involved. They have jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act for waters of the United States, which would include wetlands in some circumstances. So if you're going to be doing any construction in the wetlands, you would need a permit from the Corps. And then also, say you're passing near a national park or a Department of Defense installation, you may be consulting with them, especially if one of your alignments would go on their land. You would need access from them as well. And there's a few other laws and executive orders that are broadly applicable. One is National Historic Preservation Act. So if there's any cultural resources that could be impacted along the route, that law applies to that, as well as historical resources. So the lead agency would handle that one. And then executive orders on environmental justice, as well as floodplains, and a few others. Limited English proficiency being one when you're doing your outreach, ensuring that you're providing the material to the community in the language that is predominantly spoken in that community, and even if that's multiple languages other than English. So agencies will kind of have an analysis that they do at this scoping level to just figure out all that, how are we going to work with these other agencies? What type of outreach do we need to do? What languages might we need some of our notices printed in so we can ensure that we're meeting the community's needs. And then it progresses through, publication of a draft review, receipt of comments, and then ultimately publication of final. And as someone mentioned, I think it was Mary Jo, one of the principles of NEPA is that the agency preserves as one of the alternatives they're looking at, the alternative of no action. Right, so the agency can choose, for whatever reason that they're not going to approve the project. The one thing that is, NEPA is predominantly procedural requirement. Case law from the Supreme Court indicates that that agencies could choose the alternative that has like the worst environmental impacts of all the alternatives they're looking at. There's not a requirement that just because they found, well, this one route avoids one impact, that's then preferable. And oftentimes, when you're looking at these big long linear projects, each one has some impact that's adverse and others, so there's these resource trade-offs, and that's something that's in the law left to really the discretion of like the federal, the policy officials that are looking at things. So that's a quick overview. I'll stop there so that Mary Jo can go on the state side.
Yeah, simple stuff. So we have a kind of network of different jurisdictions. Depending on what potential impacts or areas a project goes through, it's going to be involved with different federal agencies granting specific permits for those jurisdictions. Like you mentioned, Clean Water Act, Waters of the United States, regions potentially endangered species, and so on. So we have a lot of different elements and review processes for different permits at different agencies at the federal level. And Mary Jo, let's hear about state and local levels.
So as I mentioned earlier, NEPA and CEQA are pretty similar in their approaches and what they look at. There are some differences. In CEQA, we have 20 areas that we need to cover, and they range from aesthetics, air quality, biology, cultural resources, hydrology, services. It's a whole range of things. One of the differences is that in CEQA, we don't look at economic impacts, and I believe that is something that is covered in NEPA. As a state agency, the California Public Utilities Commission, we worry about how much all the people in the state of California pay for their energy. So we actually do care about the economics of projects. And so I guess that in some ways we cover that. As Michael said, the agency isn't really required to approve a project. There's always the no project alternative. I think that for my agency, that is not often the choice that's made, but it does happen. And sometimes it is because of social and environmental justice issues. So I think that there's certainly a place for public involvement that can affect decision makers and how they're going to look at a project and approve it or disapprove it. For my agency, we actually have a social and environmental justice policy that was voted on by our commission, I think last year. And it's not, set in stone, but it's definitely a guiding document that we all use when we're looking at and reviewing projects. So I think that's a tool that other agencies could use, and that would be very helpful. Like in NEPA, we get what triggers CEQA in California is that an agency has a discretionary approval of a project. So we just don't go out and decide that this looks like a terrible idea and we're going to go and stop it. There actually has to be, for my agency, a formal application that comes in, and that starts us looking at the project, doing public outreach and involvement. We hire environmental consulting firms to help us prepare our environmental documents. We work with other agencies. There's usually, the local agencies, California Fish and Wildlife. For most of the big linear transmission lines we're working on in California, it's pretty hard to do any of these projects and not have a federal nexus. That the Bureau of Land Management oversees a great deal of the land in the desert part of the California and in southern part of California. In Northern California, there's a lot of Forest Service lands. So we end up working pretty closely with the federal agencies. And it's I know for BLM, they went maybe, I'm going to say 15 years ago, maybe they went from being a kind of more of a resource management agency where they, do mining and grazing permits to becoming a much more energy-focused agency in terms of dealing with all of the big renewable projects that are happening in the state.
Thanks so much. And yeah, this is really helpful to hear about some of the distinctions on the state and federal levels, but also, as you were saying, the overlaps and intersections of them, how it's really hard to have a project go through that doesn't also trigger federal permitting review at the same time. And so there's a role for collaboration and coordination across those jurisdictions as well. So let me go to Raul. We've heard an overview of how the process works. It is complicated and technical in many ways, but the reason we're talking about this is because it is also deeply important to the well-being of the Latino community in the U.S. So I want to hear from you about why permitting is relevant to the community, what is at stake in efforts to reform the permitting process, and the sort of balance that I was mentioning about building out clean energy, but also safeguarding those environmental and community protections.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about permitting, I think that as Michael mentioned, right, there is this sort of broader umbrella of decisions that take place during the permitting, right? And that's sort of, where is the project going to happen? What design are you going to use? What stakeholders are you going to involve in its design? And the reason why it's so important, why this process is so important to the Latino community is because, as Michael mentioned, most of these polluting facilities and most of these transmission lines and sort of infrastructure that comes about that are done in the name of the national interest, which at times is very valid, happens in communities of color. And so communities of color, particularly Black and Latino communities across the country, have to absorb most of the pollution. We don't have to go very far, right? But whenever we're talking about it, and we have focused on NEPA, right? So we have focused on NEPA, and NEPA is that umbrella kind of statute that allows us a mechanism to analyze many different contexts. But permitting is broader. Permitting includes the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. It includes many state laws as well as local ones. And so just to give you an example, when there was a sterilizer facility in Laredo, Texas, sterilizing facilities have to emit ethylene oxide, which is a known carcinogen, particularly for children. Now, there is this particular facility right in Laredo, Texas, not 1 mile away from it. It's one of Laredo's elementary schools. What does that mean? Laredo is it's in the 90th percentile in terms of its Latino population. Most people in Laredo are Latino by far. That means that all of the people that are living, their children, their families everybody has to breathe in that air. And that air is poison. There is no other way to describe it. It's not just contaminated, it's not just dirty, it's poison with this chemical that gets breathed in, breathed out, day in, day out. They're basically being forced to do this. And so what happens is that when we talk about it concretely, we see higher asthma rates in Latino populations, higher cancer rates in Latino populations. We see higher immunological diseases in Latino populations. Why? It's because a lot of these industries are contaminating the water, the food, the air that we consume. And so that's why it's important. A lot of folks, particularly in urban areas, probably face this, right? Where we have the example of the ironbound community in New Jersey, for example, where you have a port, you have a large hub of, so you have a large international port, then you have a large hub of freight and trains. Then you're surrounded by I-95 on the other side. And so you're basically engulfed, surrounded, literally surrounded by all of these pollution sources. That's not affecting, even though those things are created for the sake of the national interest, it doesn't affect us all the same way. It impacts the people in ironbound community, which, by the way, primarily people of color, they are the ones who actually have to absorb all of this burden for everyone else to benefit, right? And so when we need to talk about permitting, we need to talk about equity in the context of our own energy infrastructure development. And so what that means is, fine, if we're all going to have the benefits, then we should probably all receive the adequate version, our adequate share of the burden. Mm-hmm. But what's more is that in the current permitting conversation that we're having, even in Congress today, is that we are forced into this kind of false dichotomy that you either need to have a healthy environment or you need to transition rapidly to renewable energy, and you need to build transmission, and that you cannot do both at the same time. And that is utterly false. You can do both at the same time. You can build transmission lines in order to connect us to the clean energy sources. And at the same time, we can protect communities. And those protections need to be based on our laws, on our current laws that we have today, and ways to improve those laws. And so for us to really find a way to have both, we have to have a more nuanced conversation than just say that it's about permitting. When we're talking about transmission lines, when we're talking about clean energy projects, it's not just about permitting. But if we did want to talk about permitting, I would point to, for example, a recent study by MIT. MIT concluded that the biggest hurdle that stops renewable energy projects in the United States is not the permitting process itself, but it's the lack of engagement with communities on the front end. And so that brings about an antagonistic relationship between the communities on the ground and the project sponsor that wants to get this project built. Instead of the project sponsor actually going to the community first and saying, like, you know what, I'm thinking about building these transmission lines. I'm talking about building these kinds of things. How can we make this work together? Right? And so I think that that's part of it. And in a more nuanced conversation, when we're talking about transitioning to renewables, we have to think about what are the actual obstacles. And most of those obstacles are actually outside of the permitting process. So that goes to, or at least outside of the NEPA process per se, like as we would describe it. They go to issues about siting authority, which Michael described earlier, that, we need to have we need to have a faster system in order to decide siting. So where are these projects going to go? But that doesn't mean you weaken the public comment period, for example, right? So the proposals that we're seeing in Congress, both last year and this year, are saying things like, we need to improve siting authority. Oh, by the way, we need to shorten the public comment period. Mm-hmm. That doesn't match. That doesn't work that way. In fact, by shortening the public comment period, you're actually alienating the public, the very communities that you want to benefit. So I would argue you need to do the opposite. But then we also have to think about cost allocation. When we're talking about transmission lines, for example, it happens that the way that we pay for things is very weird in this system. So what essentially happens is that say we need a new transmission line because we need to carry more energy in the same route, right? And so the way that cost allocation happens is that I'm the sixth project that requires that transmission line to be used. And that transmission line needs to be upgraded. I have to cover the entire cost of the upgrade, even though I'm one of six projects that will be using that upgraded transmission line, right? So it's not just about permitting, it's about cost allocation. So let's talk about siting. Let's have a more nuanced conversation. Let's talk about siting. Let's talk about cost allocation. Let's talk about how we build, not just project by project, so that but a broader planning process, so that we know how these transmission lines can cross state lines, can feed into other hubs from where there is energy generation to where the energy consumption actually happens. Uh, None of those things are done any service when we just say we need permitting reform, right? If we actually want to speed up, and we can and we should speed up transmission lines and renewable energy projects, then let's get down to what's actually stopping them. Let's make sure that the fossil fuel interests and other interests are not using this permitting reform conversation as a Trojan horse to diminish protections that communities actually need in order to protect their health, their safety, their lives, their children. So I think it requires a more nuanced conversation and an utter rejection of this false dichotomy that we have to pick between transitioning to a climate safe future and protecting our communities today.
Well, thank you, Raul, and I'm definitely with you on the false dichotomy there. And the title of this is the dual challenge of the speed and environmental justice, and achieving both of those is going to be critical to being able to say that we've been successful in addressing these challenges. There are a few things I want to double click on that I think are important in what you were saying. Definitely the examples you were mentioning of pollution from existing projects in Latino communities are really illustrative. The Laredo plant, especially with the ethylene oxide pollution, is not something that you want to see in our country that we would be proud of. And these are projects that have gone through the permitting process that exists today and were authorized by the sort of institution that we have. And so I think that especially underscores the challenge of not only having to speed up the process of permitting, but do that in a way that makes sure that those sorts of projects aren't having the impacts that they're having even under the existing system. And another thing that you were mentioning is the sort of broader universe of processes and steps outside of what you might strictly call permitting or environmental review in building projects, the siting, and so forth, and how we shouldn't use reform of the permitting process as an excuse to cut down on some of the bedrock protections that we have in place right now. So I think what's important there, and that has sort of come around in a lot of the comments we've heard, is the NEPA process at the federal level, which is the National Environmental Protection Act, or CEQA at the state level, the California Environmental Quality Act, which, as you all have mentioned, provide this requirement for doing an environmental review of a project and evaluating alternatives for the project and what the impact would be on the environment and on the communities around those projects. So I want to drill down a little bit into those specific elements of the permitting process because they exist separate from some of those individual permits that we were mentioning for example, the Army Corps of Engineers for water and so forth. We've heard a little bit about how those NEPA and CEQA processes work and how the environmental reviews go. One piece of the conversation in relation to those, especially as we talk about permitting reform in Congress now that you were touching on, Raul, is shortening the public comment period or somehow curtailing the environmental review process. And those laws get a lot of ire for being too long of a process in the broader permitting landscape. How do those arguments, and I think I'll pose this to the three of you, how do those arguments hold up to you in the way that NEPA specifically has been targeted as a cause for long lead times for permitting? And what do you see as the importance of NEPA and CEQA, being that they don't require any specific action? As you said, Michael, they're procedural, and at the end of the line, after doing the reviews, a project can still move forward with what's determined to be the most polluting option. But what value do those bring, and how do you think about the arguments against those?
Yeah, thanks. Happy to take a first crack at it. So, in terms of the value, touch on that first. NEPA is essentially is referred to as a look before you leap statute, right? It requires the federal agency to do that analysis and assessment and be transparent with the public about what the effects are going to be. And to Raul's point, that's an opportunity for the public to have their voice heard. And so I think that's, part of, the core of NEPA. And there has been some academic research with respect to, do project proposals actually improve during the NEPA process, like from the proposed action that comes in the door to what the agency finally approves. And the finding of the research is that they do. So, project proponents are, as part of the environmental review process, it tends to shift the project to, having fewer environmental impacts or reducing the magnitude. So I think that that's an important part of, why we have these laws. And in terms of the legislative debate, I won't go into that in great detail. But one thing that I would highlight is just that we have seen a number of laws in, say, the last 15, even 20 years that have modified or provided some sort of overlay for the environmental review process to try to make it more efficient. And I think that there is, reason to believe that those, have worked and are working. The most recent of which was passed just with the bipartisan infrastructure law in the fall of 2021, as it applies to the Department of Transportation and its surface transportation agencies. So, there is work going on to implement those. Another recent one that applies more broadly from the 2015 FAST Act established the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. And so they have, the federal permitting dashboard where a lot of these complex projects appear. And, it's a transparency function. It's also, requires that they coordinate it, and be transparent about timelines and have a more, predictable process. So I think there are legislative tools out there that have been applied that, they don't alter, as Raul was mentioning, the underlying laws themselves, but provide for greater efficiency and just improved essentially management of the federal process. Because I think a lot of the challenges that we see, instances where maybe the NEPA process didn't work great, it often is, I think, in my view, a management challenge or resource challenge within the agency. So that's or I'll leave it, but you get other voices in here.
Thanks, Michael.
I will weigh in here a little bit. So when my group gets an application in for a electric facility, we have a bunch of decisions to make. And one of them is the project exempt. And there are certain exemptions that exist under our California Environmental Quality Act. If we look at the project and we deem that there won't be any environmental impacts, then that puts us down a different path. So, but in addition to doing an environmental impact report, there's another option under CEQA, and that is to do a mitigated negative declaration. So if you look at the project and you can determine that you can mitigate all the significant environmental impacts to a level less than significant, you can do this somewhat of a CEQA-light analysis, in which case you don't look at alternatives to the project. You just look at the proposed project and assess that on its face value. And so that actually can speed up the permitting requirements. Not, a huge amount, but can probably save you 6 to 9 months, maybe a year. And so I think that's an option that works well. Whether NEPA and CEQA actually result in better outcomes and better projects, I would say that in most cases, in my experience, they do. That we look to alternatives for the project, which include, like for a transmission line, non-wire alternatives. So we can look at doing microgrids, of putting in battery storage instead of putting in a big new transmission line. So there's a lot of things that we can use the CEQA process for that results in, I think, better outcomes. It doesn't always happen. If you're looking to bring, we recently approved a 125-mile transmission line, most of which was in Arizona. And we did not permit the part in Arizona, but we did permit the 20 miles that hit the California border into California. And if you're trying to bring in renewable resources from another state, you know you're looking at a transmission line. You can't change that into a microgrid or something like that. But and one of the challenges that we have with renewable resources is that the renewable resources are very often far from the load centers. So when you look at the big solar facilities we have in California, they're mostly out in the desert. If you look at the wind projects, they're pretty much far from the load center. So you're going to end up with transmission lines that bring those to where the people need the electricity. And 50 years ago, we were putting in power plants right in the middle of load centers, and there was a lot of environmental justice issues that went along with that. But we didn't have big, long transmission lines. So I think there's a lot of trade-offs you have to make for all of these projects. And I think you need to be thoughtful and clever in trying to figure out how to get the projects that you need as we move into a zero carbon future, and really do things that don't impact communities, that don't scar the environment. For transmission lines, aesthetics is a huge problem. Nobody wants to see big transmission lines marching down their communities. But I think that, on the other hand, ultimately, if we can get to zero carbon energy world, that will change a lot of people's health in their lives, and I think that's an important consideration to think about.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's all really helpful, and I appreciate both of you jumping in on that. I think that the other piece that would be important to pull through in the context of these environmental review laws, but also broadly in how the permitting process goes, is the public participation element. There are requirements in the process for permitting that we have public engagement opportunities for the public to provide input or comment on a proposed project. But I think there's a case to be made that the way that process works right now uplifts the wrong interests or voices and doesn't give enough of a platform to the disadvantaged communities that are being burdened by the pollution of these projects. And I think there are a couple ways that happens. One is that we've seen sort of objections to clean energy projects that have been successful on the grounds of specific environmental concerns, sometimes done in bad faith and sort of quietly advanced by fossil interests that would like to see those renewable projects not go through, but through creating arguments on the basis of protecting a particular species that might be harmed by a project or so forth. And then we've also had issues with the public actually, or the disadvantaged communities that might be affected by a project participating in a meaningful way. That it's sometimes the understanding of the project or the opportunity to comment doesn't reach the communities that would actually be impacted by the project, or it's not super accessible to provide public comment in when there's an opportunity to. But on the flip side, the sort of well-funded groups that have armies of lawyers and so forth are much better positioned to provide public comment and use that sort of public engagement process to move projects in their interest. I'd like to hear your all reactions to that. I'll start with Raul and hear about whether you think that there are alternatives or ways that the public participation process can be sort of calibrated to flip the way that those interests are valued or the voices are heard in that process.
Right. Right. You mentioned in your last question, you also brought up the context of legislation. And so how do you reform a process that is sort of too good or not good enough, depending on who you are. I would point to initiatives like the Environmental Justice for All Act, recently renamed the Donald McEachin Environmental Justice for All Act in honor of late Representative McEachin. But that law delineates not just the idea or the opportunity of having public comment, but it also sends in resources into the agencies, which, as Michael mentioned, are a lot of times dealing with huge constraints in terms of staffing and in terms of just being able to have the resources to do the job that they need to do. That law or that bill sends in money in order to do that to the agencies, sends in the adequate structure, and it also serves as a guide. A lot of times people talk about the permitting process as a series of obstacles, but then you have bills like the Environmental Justice for All Act that are actually more of a guide for both agencies, for the project sponsor, and for the communities themselves. Because that bill doesn't just say, okay, you have 90 days to get in your public comments. That bill actually says, yeah, there are 90 days to submit public comment. And on top of that, the agency has the duty in order to do adequate, culturally competent outreach to the communities that are going to be most impacted. Now, that duty without resources would be a problem, but we have resources also in that same piece of legislation, right? And so you sort of have this trifecta of good ideas in the permitting process, which is fund the agencies, charge the agencies with adequate outreach, and then give the public an opportunity to weigh in. Now, I put it in let me put it in real context, right? Because this is reality in a lot of our communities, and particularly in Latino communities across the country. We have, in the environmental review process, the government creates, or sometimes the project sponsors create, some of the most complicated, hard to read environmental analyses that exist out there. So here's what we're asking public to do. We're asking, say, a single mother trying to hold down one or two jobs to feed her family, to care for her family, to hold down her jobs. Who knows what else she has going on. And on top of that, she's supposed to be able to read these very complicated project descriptions, project analyses. And then, God forbid, she finds something wrong in those projects. And she says, you know what, this actually doesn't check out. She has to then file comments on that. Now, what a lot of these bad proposals that we're seeing in Congress would do is that they say, well, we got to shorten the statute of limitations so that people cannot sue a project that is poorly done. And so what does that mean for that mother now? Not only did she have to rush to get her comment in on top of all the other things she had to deal with, now she cannot sue unless she provided those comments. Oh, and you used to have more time in order for you to figure out if something was wrong with that project. But we've seen shortcuts in the NEPA process that say that you cannot sue further than 150 days. That's 5 months. So, and if that mother cannot go into a court and file her lawsuit within those 5 months, she's out of luck. The project's going to go forward, right? That seems genuinely unfair. And that's what we saw in the Mansion site deal, in the dirty deal that we saw last year from Senator Manchin. That's what we've seen in other NEPA rewrites that we've heard from Michael, in the past, whether it's MAP 21, whether it's WRDA, the early WRDAs from the early 2010s, or the FAST Act itself. And so We need to draw a clear differentiation between what we are trying to do. As of now, we have not seen a bill that actually addresses that addresses the permitting process in a proactive way better than the Environmental Justice for All Act. And so that's something that needs to be put forward. And a lot of these other proposals that would give green lights to pipelines and would give green lights to all sorts of dirty fuel industry, those things need to be put aside. Those things don't need to be considered. And we need to move forward with a more nuanced conversation about what we need to do to transmission, which again lies very much outside of the permitting context.
Great. Any other quick comments, and then we can go to some audience Q&A on the public participation piece?
I would just add one thing, which from a practitioner's perspective, one of the interesting things that has come out of COVID, if anything actually good has come out of COVID, we went for our public outreach and involvement process. We went from very much a model where we would often have meetings in different locations. One would be in during business hours, often in the early afternoon, and then the next meeting would be early evening. And the afternoon or early morning project or early morning meeting would be mostly with local agencies and officials to talk about their perspective on projects. And then the later meeting would be for mostly community involvement, based on the notion that people are going to be at work during the day and they'll come and participate later in the evening after work. When COVID hit, we stopped doing outreach physically, and we started doing electronic meetings, virtual meetings. We've done both in terms of sometimes having a hybrid meeting arrangement. And what we discovered is that actually we got much more community involvement when we went to a hybrid or a virtual meeting arrangement. So I think it is that's just worth noting that we're seeing a lot more people participating in our projects. Last week, my group interviewed 2 environmental consulting firms for a substation project in Northern California, and one of the environmental firms spent a lot more time talking about their public outreach efforts that they were proposing for this project, as opposed to the other one that talked more about some of the more technical aspects of the project. And we chose the group that really talked about public outreach. So I think there are ways that you can get more public involvement, and no one knows more about these projects than the local people in terms of what the environmental impacts are. That I mean, we have maps, and we have biologists, and we do spring surveys, but the local people know their local environment, and it's a resource that I think we should all be taking advantage of.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate the thoughtful comments from both of you on the ways that you can improve public participation and engagement. And you definitely see how there are very human scale elements to the accessibility of the public engagement process, like whether it's on Zoom and you can log in after work more easily, or whether it's feasible to be involved when you have so much else going on in your life. And those sorts of considerations, I think, are going to be key to making sure that that process is open to the people that would actually be affected by those projects. So I'm going to go now to some audience Q&A. We're going to have probably one question here from the audience. We got a couple of good ones, but I'll focus in on this one. And we could just open it up to the 3 of you panelists for some brief answers on this one. And then we can start to wrap up. But this one comes from a friend of CHCI, Daniel Duron. He says that energy developers consistently see overlap in permitting requirements that create an administrative burden and increase the project cost substantially. And those costs are passed down ultimately to working class families through rate increases. So how are federal, state, and local entities working together to address that overlap? I think referring to a redundancy of requirements in the permitting process while still protecting communities.
Happy to lead off on that one, Amar. Great question. There is certainly, as we heard from Mary Jo, similar environmental review required in the state of California is required, federally. So what happens when you've got both federal and state involvement, and you're going to have these multiple laws in effect? One option is to, essentially coordinate as a, cooperating co-lead agencies. So there is, with a fair bit of frequency, we do see it in practice that a federal lead agency and the state of California entity will serve as, co-lead agencies and create a joint NEPA CEQA document. Certainly doesn't happen in all instances, and I think there's more that can be done to promote that. But the laws are similar enough that they, you can kind of conduct them in sequence. Slightly different requirements, but nevertheless, it's CEQ's regulations, and then some of the guidance that's come out in this administration, the Biden-Harris Permitting Action Plan that came out in May of last year, and then the guidance that followed in March of this year emphasize, that coordination with states, tribes, localities that have jurisdiction over these projects, because ultimately, from the project proponent's perspective, right, it's kind of a single, governmental permitting process that they need to get through before they can start putting steel in the ground or what have you. So it's definitely, there's opportunities there. There's certainly more work to do. I think technological tools are one answer, so we can better collaborate across levels of government. But appreciate the question and interested to hear what Raul and Mary Jo have to say.
Well, I'll go. So I'm going to say maybe 6 to 8 to maybe 10 years ago, my agency did more federal state joint NEPA CEQA documents. When the Trump administration came on board, they limited the length of NEPA documents, I think, to 300 pages. And for our agency, we didn't find that at all sufficient to look at the environmental impacts of what could be, a 175-mile transmission line. And so we stopped, I think, not totally, but we took a long pause in whether we wanted to continue doing state federal NEPA CEQA documents. We're looking at that again. It's a very complicated process, and once you involve both federal and state agencies, it becomes even more complicated. Ideally, and we have found when we are driving the bus and we are the lead agency and we're controlling the document both at the NEPA and CEQA level, we find that it goes quicker for us than if it's the federal agency that's controlling the preparation of the environmental document.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there are a lot of things that the administration can do on its own. So we spent a lot of time talking about legislation, but there are a lot of things that the administration can do, particularly around transmission. The first one, for example, a lot of transmission lines fall under the jurisdiction of FERC, which is an independent agency that authorizes a lot, not everything, but a lot that has to do with transmission lines at a federal level. That FERC right now doesn't have a chair, right? That's something that the administration needs to have an appointment for. And then FERC itself can do something like 3 or 4 rulemakings without any further legislative authority in order for them to actually speed things up themselves. So whether it's about siting, whether it's about cost allocation, whether it's about sort of macro planning, a lot of those things are already there. And I think that it's also important as they go through that process, and as we think about legislative proposals, it's important to highlight that the process of changing the permitting scheme is not just something that needs to be done in a hasty way. And I think Mary Jo just brought up a great example of it, right? The Trump administration, for a long time, said we were going to speed up permitting because this is a problem, and it takes 10 years, and it really doesn't take 10 years to permit these projects. But so they said we're going to set page limits, thinking that we're going to make things more simple. People are not going to have to read as long. They just complicated the process. They made it longer. So it's counterintuitive. The same thing happens under judicial review, for example, when they say we're going to shorten the statute of limitations so that people can only sue within 150 days of when the final decision was made on a project. Well, that's going to backfire because a lot of people that want to stop that project before used to be able to go to a lawyer, go to a scientist, figure out if they actually had a claim in court. And if they didn't have a claim, if they didn't think they could win, then they wouldn't bring forward the lawsuit. But guess what? When you don't have that time, but you have a deadline, what they're going to do is that they're going to file suit whether or not they think they have a claim. And what is that going to result in? That's actually going to increase the challenges. Unfortunately, that's also going to increase the challenges to the good projects, right? And so we talked about the permitting process as it is not an obstacle. It's an obstacle for bad projects. It's a way to improve decent projects, and it's a way to get buy-in for good projects. And so all of these kind of hasty measures are really going to throw things off. So as we are contemplating how do we address changes to the permitting process, it's very important that, one, we put communities first. And we reject sort of the notions of these like trickle-down economics. That's not really how that works. We can't believe that that's actually how it works when we see that profits, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, are through the roof, right? So the idea that you have these fossil fuel CEOs getting bigger and bigger paychecks, and that they're passing along the cost to the consumer, that should be cracked down on the industry side of things. That has nothing to do with the permitting process.
Well, thank you, all of you, for that question and kind of the full discussion. I'll wrap us up a little bit.
Can I just add one more thing? Raul, thank you for bringing up FERC jurisdictional issues. FERC currently has a notice of proposed rulemaking that my agency is getting ready to file some comments on. I think comments are due sometime in May. That has to do with federal energy corridors. And we're interested in the concept. We're somewhat concerned that that some of the rules might be set up in a way that games the system and doesn't allow for good state involvement. But it's a complicated process, and it'll be interesting to see what the comments are that come in for this rulemaking, and who's making the comments, and how will FERC react to it.
Definitely some exciting developments on the transmission side. Well, listen, this was a really, really exciting and insightful discussion for me, and hopefully for everyone watching. And I think we saw how complex the permitting process is, and also how challenging it is to find a good solution that balances the speed and the environmental justice elements of that process. But I'm glad that this group here is working on it, because it gives me a good amount of hope in finding that right solution in the end. So let me thank the panel again. I wish we could do a round of applause, but not much kind of possibility online. But really appreciate the discussion. Looking forward to continuing to sort through how we can make the permitting process work for both building clean energy and for protecting our communities. And with that, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you very much.
Good. Thanks, all.